God, Gold, and Graves. Episode 1. The Paper That Enslaved the World. The Story of Dum Diversas, the Papal Bull. That started it all. The Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. Daniel 7:9, KJV. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. Revelation 1:14-15, KJV. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish. They are black unto the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. Jeremiah 14:2, KJV. Cold open. In 1452, a man sat down in Rome and wrote a letter. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a general, he wasn't a soldier, he was a pope. And with that one letter, written in Latin, stamped with a papal seal, handed to a king across the Mediterranean, the world changed. Not slowly, not quietly, violently. That letter had a name. Dum Diversas. And what it said, in plain language, stripped of all the holy language, was this: you have permission to invade their lands, capture their people, put them into permanent slavery, and take everything they own, forever, in the name of God. This is episode 1 of God, Gold, and Graves. This is the story of how a document no one told you about in school became the legal and spiritual foundation for the largest forced displacement, enslavement, and killing of human beings in recorded history. This is the story of how your family, and millions of families across Africa, across the Americas, across Asia, lost their land, their names, their languages, and their lives, and how the system it created is still running today. The cry of Jerusalem is gone up. Jeremiah 14:2, KJV. Part 1. The World Before the Letter. What existed before colonization arrived. Before we talk about the letter, we need to talk about what the world looked like before it, because one of the biggest lies history tells is that the people who got colonized were somehow waiting to be saved, that they were empty lands and simple people. That is not what happened. In 1452, the year Pope Nicholas V put pen to parchment, there were thriving, sophisticated civilizations across the globe that Europe hadn't even seen yet. In West Africa, in what is now Ghana, Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, there were kingdoms with organized governments, international trade networks, universities, and legal systems. The Mali Empire had already produced Mansa Musa, one of the wealthiest human beings in the entire history of the planet. Timbuktu was a center of scholarship and Islamic learning that drew students from across the known world. In the Americas, which Europe still didn't know existed yet, over 60 million people were living across what is now North, Central, and South America. The Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Taino people of the Caribbean, all with their own governments, their own spirituality, their own economies, their own stories. These were not primitive people. These were not empty lands. But that didn't matter to the men in Rome, because as far as the Catholic Church was concerned in 1452, if you weren't Christian, you weren't fully human. And if you weren't fully human, you had no rights that a Christian king was required to respect. That was the theology. And Dum Diversas was the policy. Part 2, the man who wrote it, Pope Nicholas V, scholar, builder of the Vatican Library, author of A Genocide Pope Nicholas V, born Tommaso Parentucelli in 1397, became pope in 1447. He was a scholar, a lover of books. He is credited with founding the Vatican Library. He is remembered in Catholic history as a Renaissance man of culture and learning. He is not taught in schools as the man who gave legal permission to enslave the world, but that is exactly what he did. By the early 1450s, Portugal was already making moves. Portuguese explorers had been sailing down the West African coast for years, raiding coastal villages, capturing people, and bringing them back to Portugal to sell as enslaved labor. This was not a secret. The Portuguese crown was not hiding it. But they wanted something more than just the ability to do it. They wanted God's blessing. They wanted legal cover, moral cover, spiritual cover. So King Afonso V of Portugal, Afonso V, sent a request to Rome. He said, essentially, we are fighting the enemies of Christ. Give us your authority. Bless what we're doing. Make it official. And Pope Nicholas V, sitting in the Vatican, in the most powerful religious position in the Western world, said yes. On June 18, 1452, he issued Dum Diversas. The Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. Daniel 7:9, KJV, 1. This is who God is, not what they painted on cathedral ceilings. Part 3. What it actually said. The raw text, no sugarcoating, no church spin. Let's be very clear about what this document said, because people who defend the Catholic Church's history will tell you it has been misread, that it was only about a specific military conflict, that it was limited in scope. Read the words yourself. We grant to you by these present documents with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. Dum Diversas, 1452, Pope Nicholas V. Wherever they may be, not in this one specific territory, not in this one conflict, wherever they may be. Scholars have noted that Dum Diversas was essentially geographically unlimited in its application. It didn't point to one region, it pointed to the whole non-Christian world. And the key phrase, the one that unlocked 4 centuries of horror, is perpetual slavery. Not temporary captivity, not indentured servitude, not prisoners of war with rights, permanent, forever, hereditary. That meant your children were enslaved, and their children, and their children's children. The document didn't just permit enslavement, it created the legal architecture for race-based generational slavery, and it had the highest authority in the Catholic Church behind it. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. Revelation 1:14-15, KJV. The Son of God they claimed to represent looked nothing like who they told you. He was. Part 4. The Chain Reaction. 3 bulls that broke the world. 1452, 1455, 1493. Dum Diversas didn't stand alone. It was the first domino. 3 years later, in January 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued a second document, Romanus Pontifex. This one went further. It explicitly confirmed Portugal's rights to all territories they had discovered along the West African coast, and extended the right to enslave not just to captured enemies, but to all non-Christian natives in any territory Portugal reached. It gave Portugal a monopoly on the entire West African trade, including the trade in human beings. It also said something that would echo for centuries, that enslaving Africans was a Christianizing influence, that slavery would bring them to the faith, that it was, in some twisted logic, a mercy. That idea, the lie that slavery was somehow good for black people, didn't start with American slaveholders. It started with a pope. And then in 1493, the year after Christopher Columbus bumped into the Caribbean, Pope Alexander VI issued the third document in this chain, Inter Caetera. Columbus had just sailed, under the Spanish flag. Spain and Portugal were now competing for the same lands, so Pope Alexander VI drew a line, literally, across a map of the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the west of that line belonged to Spain. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. One man, one line, 2 countries. The entire world divided like property. This became the legal foundation for what scholars call the doctrine of discovery, the idea that any land not already claimed by a Christian ruler was available to be discovered, and claimed, by European powers. It didn't matter that millions of people were already living there. If they weren't Christian, the land was legally considered unoccupied. Terra nullius. Empty land. That legal fiction, born in Rome, stamped with the Pope's seal, justified by theology, is still embedded in the laws of the United States, Canada, and Australia right now in 2026. Part 5. West Africa. Where it started. Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Kingdom of Congo. The first region to feel the full weight of Dum Diversas was West Africa. Portugal had already been raiding the coast before the bull was issued. As early as 1441, Portuguese sailors captured African people from the coast of Mauritania and brought them back to sell in Portugal. But after 1452, it became official, organized, industrial. Portugal established trading posts, fortified castles on the African coast, and began buying and capturing enslaved people at scale. The most infamous of these was Elmina Castle on the coast of present-day Ghana, built in 1482. It sat on the Gold Coast, a name the Europeans gave it because of the gold they were extracting, and it became one of the primary holding sites for enslaved Africans before the Middle Passage. People were held in dungeons beneath the castle. No light, no space, disease, starvation. The women were raped by the Portuguese governor. The men were chained. Above the dungeon was a church. The same people who ran the castle, who presided over those dungeons, held mass upstairs. God and gold. In the same building. The regions of West Africa most targeted included Senegambia, what is now Senegal and Gambia, which supplied thousands of enslaved people in the earliest decades of the trade. The Upper Guinea coast, present-day Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. The Goldie coast, present-day Ghana, which became a hub for both the gold trade and the slave trade. The Bight of Benin and Bight of Biafra, present-day Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, which would become among the most heavily trafficked regions in the entire transatlantic trade, and the Congo-Angola region, West Central Africa, including the Kingdom of Congo, which became one of the most critical supply regions for enslaved people to Brazil and the Americas. Notably, the Congolese elite actually adopted Christianity and tried to use their Christian faith to negotiate with Portugal, to appeal to the Pope's own rules, to slow the slave trade. It didn't work. The scale of what happened on the African continent is hard to fully calculate. Historians estimate that approximately 12.5 million African people were forcibly put on slave ships and transported across the Atlantic between 1526 and 1866. Of those, approximately 1.8 million, nearly 2 million people, did not survive the ocean crossing. They died on the ships, but that is only the people who made it to the ships. Untold numbers died in raids on their villages, died on forced marches to the coast, sometimes hundreds of miles, died in the holding dungeons waiting for the next ship. Historians have estimated that for every 100 enslaved people who arrived in the Americas, another 40 had already died in Africa or during the crossing. That means the real human cost. When you account for the violence in Africa, the marches, the dungeons, the death rate at sea approaches 20 million people or more. And that is before you count the cost to the communities left behind. A large percentage of the people taken were young men and women in their childbearing years. The people left behind were the elderly, the sick, the children, the least able to rebuild. The transatlantic slave trade deliberately extracted the productive generations. It was designed to destroy not just individuals, but the economic and social future of entire regions. By 1800, the African continent's population was estimated to be half of what it would have been had the slave trade never happened. Half. That is not a statistic. That is a civilization that was stolen. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish. They are black unto the ground. And the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. Jeremiah 14:2, KJV. Their cry went up too. It still has not been answered. Part 6. The Americas. The Great Dying, 56 million people. 90% of the indigenous population. Gone. When Columbus arrived in 1492, just 40 years after Dum Diversas, he landed in the Caribbean. He encountered the Taino people of what is now the Bahamas and Hispaniola. He described them as gentle, intelligent, and generous. And then he enslaved them. Within 50 years of European contact, the Taino people were effectively extinct. Their population, estimated at around 1 million at the time of first contact, was reduced to near zero through a combination of forced labor in gold mines, mass killing, disease, and famine engineered by the Spanish system of encomienda, essentially plantation slavery. The same pattern repeated across the Americas. Before European contact, scholars at University College London estimate that approximately 60 million people lived across North, Central, and South America. That was about 10% of the entire world's population at the time. Within roughly 100 years of European colonization, that number had been reduced to somewhere between 5 and 6 million. 56 million people. Gone. Researchers call it the Great Dying. It is the largest human mortality event in proportion to global population in recorded history, second only to World War II in absolute numbers. It was larger, proportionally, than the Black Death in Europe. The causes were disease, yes. Indigenous people had no immunity to European pathogens like smallpox, measles, and influenza. But disease alone does not explain what happened. Disease was accelerated and weaponized by war, by forced labor, by displacement, by the deliberate destruction of food sources, by the encomienda and meta systems that worked people to death in mines and fields. Disease did not choose those people randomly. European policy created the conditions that made them vulnerable. In the Caribbean, the Taino, the Arawak, and the Caribs were eliminated within decades. The Spanish then replaced them with enslaved Africans, imported under the authority of Dum Diversas and Inter Caetera. Approximately 4.5 million enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean over the course of the trade. Brazil was the largest single destination for enslaved Africans in the entire transatlantic trade. Approximately 3.2 million enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil, more than 10 times the number brought directly to what became the United States. Portugal, operating under the direct authority of Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex, dominated the Brazilian slave trade. Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. The Spanish conquest destroyed the Aztec Empire in 1521 under Hernán Cortés, and the Inca Empire in 1533 under Francisco Pizarro. In Mexico, the indigenous population fell from approximately 25 million before contact to barely 1 million by 1600, over 90% in under 100 years. The silver mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia, the richest silver deposit in the world, were worked by forced indigenous labor under the Mita system. Millions of indigenous people died in those mines. The Spanish crown sent the profits to Rome, and the church received a cut. The colonization of North America by the English, French, and Dutch proceeded more slowly but with equal destruction. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, and Chickasaw nations suffered 25 to 50% death tolls during the forced removals of the 1830s, the Trail of Tears. By 1900, the indigenous population of the United States had fallen to approximately 237,000, down from millions at the time of first contact. When you add up the total death toll across the Americas, disease accelerated by colonialism, direct killing, forced labor, engineered famine, you reach 56 million people. Not in a war, not in a natural disaster, in a deliberate, centuries-long, papally authorized campaign of domination. Part 7. Who got rich? The Vatican's financial stake. This was never just about religion. Let's talk about the money, because this was never primarily about religion. It was always about resources. When Pope Nicholas V gave King Afonso IV permission to enslave and conquer, he was not doing it out of pure theological conviction. The Portuguese crown was paying tithes to Rome. The church had financial interests in the expansion of Portuguese power. When Portugal taxed the slave trade, a portion of those revenues flowed back to the Vatican. The Catholic Church was not just blessing the system, it was profiting from it. The wealth generated by enslaved labor and colonized resources was the economic foundation of modern Western civilization. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil, the tobacco and cotton plantations of the American South, the silver mines of Bolivia and Peru, the gold extraction of West Africa and the Gold Coast. All of it was built on labor stolen from the people Pope Nicholas V said could be reduced to perpetual servitude. And the nations that got rich, Portugal, Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, used that wealth to finance the Industrial Revolution, to build their militaries, to dominate global trade for 5 centuries. The wealth that flowed from enslaved African labor and colonized indigenous land did not just make European monarchs rich. It capitalized the banks, the shipping companies, the insurance industries, and the cotton mills that became the economic backbone of the Western world. And the people whose labor created all of that wealth, they inherited nothing. They inherited poverty. They inherited trauma. They inherited land that had been stolen and never returned. That is the continuing legacy of Dum Diversas. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. Revelation 1:14, KJV. They built churches in his name. They built them on top of dungeons. Part 8. It didn't stop in the 1500s. The Berlin Conference, King Leopold II, and 50 million more. You might be tempted to think this is ancient history, that the Papal Bulls of 1452 are a relic of a different time with no connection to the present. You would be wrong. In 1884 and 1885, representatives from 14 European nations met in Berlin. Not a single African nation was invited, and divided the entire African continent among themselves. The Berlin Conference. This was the formal beginning of what is called the Scramble for Africa. The legal and theological justification for this was still, at its root, the doctrine of discovery. The idea that African peoples, because they were not European, because they did not organize their land ownership the way Europeans did, had no sovereign claim to their own land. What happened next was a continuation of what Dum Diversas started, just with new names and updated machinery. In the Congo, given to King Leopold II of Belgium as his personal property by the Berlin Conference, Belgian forces used a system of forced labor to extract rubber. Villages were given rubber quotas. If a village failed to meet its quota, Belgian soldiers and mercenaries cut off the hands of the men, women, and children. Hands were used as proof that bullets had been spent, not wasted, so soldiers who fired their rifles had to bring back a human hand for every bullet they used. The death toll in the Congo Free State between 1885 and 1908, just 23 years, is estimated by historians at somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. That is one man, one king, one territory, one generation. 5 to 10 million people killed for rubber. The broader toll of colonialism across Africa and Asia in the 20th century, the forced labor, the engineered famines, the democide, has been estimated at 50 million or more across all colonized territories from the 1880s through independence movements in the 1960s and 1970s. When you add the transatlantic slave trade to the colonization of the Americas, to the colonization of Africa and Asia, you are looking at a combined death toll in the range of 100 to 150 million human beings over the course of roughly 5 centuries, all of it tracing back to the systems that Dum Diversas legitimized. Part 9. The Modern Day. It's still running. 2005. U.S. Supreme Court. 2023. Vatican repudiation. Congo cobalt. No reparations. Here's the part they really do not teach you. The doctrine of discovery, the legal principle born from Dum Diversas and Inter Caetera, is still embedded in the laws of the United States, Canada, and Australia right now. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court cited the doctrine of discovery in a case involving the Oneida Indian Nation. The opinion was written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a justice celebrated as a progressive icon, and it used the colonial-era doctrine to limit indigenous land rights. That is not 1493. That is 2005. In Canada, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities have fought for decades to have the doctrine removed from Canadian law. In Australia, Indigenous land claims have been contested using legal principles that trace directly to the same colonial-era doctrine. The resources being extracted from formerly colonized lands, the cobalt in the Congo used in your cell phone battery, the oil in Nigeria's Niger Delta, the lithium in Bolivia used in electric vehicles, are still flowing primarily to foreign corporations, with local populations receiving poverty wages, environmental destruction, and political repression. In 2023, after decades of indigenous pressure, Pope Francis and the Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery. They issued a statement saying it was not part of Catholic teaching, that the papal bulls did not adequately reflect the equal dignity and rights of indigenous peoples. That was significant. It was real. But here is what the Vatican statement did not do. It did not rescind the papal bulls. The Ba-Aim's actual documents, Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex, Inter Caetera, were not formally nullified. It had no legal force. Courts in the United States, Canada, and Australia are not bound by a Vatican press release. And it came with no reparations. Not a dollar, not an acre. So we are in a moment where the Church has said, with words, we repudiate what was done. But the wealth accumulated from what was done, centuries of it, remains where it is. The land remains where it is. The poverty of the descendants of the enslaved and the colonized remains where it is. Words without action are just more paper. And the world already has enough of that paper. It is called Dum Diversas. Part 10. Why this story matters now, connecting 1452 to 2026. So why are we telling this story in 2026? Because the wealth gap between Black and white Americans, the largest racial wealth gap in the developed world, does not come from nowhere. It comes from this. From centuries of stolen labor, stolen land, and denied inheritance. Because indigenous communities across North America still live on the least resource-rich land, with the highest rates of poverty, the lowest life expectancy, and the highest rates of violence against their women, direct results of the dispossession that the doctrine of discovery authorized. Because African nations that were colonized, whose resources were extracted, whose populations were enslaved or killed, whose governments were destabilized by colonial powers, are still paying the economic price. They are not developing countries. They are deliberately underdeveloped countries. Their poverty is not accidental. It was engineered. Because the Catholic Church, which generated the spiritual and legal architecture for all of this, still holds over $30 billion in assets, still wields enormous political influence in global affairs, has never paid reparations, and because if you do not know where the system came from, you cannot understand why it keeps producing the same results. One Pope, one King, one document, June 18, 1452. That is where a lot of your family's story took a turn they did not choose. And it is where this documentary series begins. Closing. Dum Diversas, translated from Latin, means while different. While different, we can be enslaved. While different, our land can be taken. While different, our lives are worth less. That idea did not start in 1452. But in 1452, it got a stamp, a seal, a signature from the highest authority in the Western world. And it has been running ever since. In episode 2, we follow the paper trail from Rome to the coast of West Africa. And we meet the people who resisted, who fought back, who said no, and what happened to them when they did. Because they resisted. They always resisted. This is God, golden graves. The hair of his head like the pure wool. Daniel 7:9. He looked like his people. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his feet like unto fine brass. Revelation 1:14-15. The sun looked like his people. They are black unto the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. Jeremiah 14:2. His people cried out. They are still crying. Sources and research notes. Primary documents. Dum Diversas, 1452. Pope NicholasV issued to King Afonso V of Portugal. Romanus Pontifex, 1455. Pope Nicholas V. Inter Caetera, 1493. Pope Alexander Sixteen. Vatican Statement on the Doctrine of Discovery. March 30th, 2023. Scripture, King James Version, KJV. Daniel 7:9. Description of the Ancient of Days, hair like pure wool. Revelation 1:14-15. The glorified Christ, hair like wool, feet like burnished brass. Jeremiah 14:2. Judah mourning, they are black unto the ground. Key statistics. 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported. Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, slavevoyages.org. Meaning 1.8 million died on the Middle Passage, slavevoyages.org. National Endowment for the Humanities. 20 million total African lives lost, port cities, Bristol, digital history. 56 million dead, the Great Dying, UCL, Quaternary Science Reviews, 2019. 5 to 10 million dead in Congo Free State, Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost, R.J. Rummel, U of Hawaii. Doctrine of Discovery, cited in U.S. Supreme Court, City of Sherrill v. Oneida. Indian Nation, 2005. Academic and news sources, Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, slavevoyages.org. National Museum of African American History and Culture, Papal Bulls exhibit. Equal Justice Initiative, The Transatlantic Slave Trade Report, University College London. The Conversation, European Colonization of the Americas, 2019. Doctrine of Discovery Project, doctrineofdiscovery.org. NPR, Al Jazeera, PBS NewsHour. Vatican repudiates Doctrine of Discovery, March 30th, 2023. Wikipedia, Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex, Atlantic Slave Trade, Catholic Church and Slavery God, Golden Graves. Episode 1 of TBD, independent documentary series, all scripture quotations from the King James Version, KJV, public domain.